welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so if you've been feeling lately like the world has just gone, a little crazy, like the ground beneath your feet isn't quite as solid as it used to be, well, you are definitely not alone.
Not at all.
We spent a lot of time on this show talking about the what, right? Like what is happening in the news, what's happening in the markets, but sometimes you get this feeling that the ground isn't just shifting, it's dissolving.
Yeah, dissolving is a good word for it. Like the rules of the game you thought you were playing have been quietly rewritten entirely while you were just, busy working, paying taxes.
Exactly. And today we are cracking open a source that is less of a standard book and honestly more of a, let's call it a tactical weapon.
A tactical weapon is certainly one way to describe it. It is definitely not light reading for a Sunday afternoon. I mean, it is dense, it is aggressive, and it is completely unapologetic.
No, absolutely not. So today we are doing a deep dive into a manifesto. And it's one that is making massive waves underground in the manosphere and honestly in the minds of anyone who is really paying attention to the state of modern masculinity right now.
Right.
The book is titled, and get ready for this, because the title alone is basically a thesis statement. It's called Women Work Products. Men extract resources, drive to death, betray, divorce, and inherit.
Yeah. Subtlety is clearly not the goal here.
Not even a little bit. It's written by Conrad Riker. And before we go any further, I just want to be totally clear with you listening right now. This is high-octane, ultra-red-pilled material.
Very much so.
We are here to impartially report on what's in this text. We're not endorsing it. But if you are ready to have your worldview challenged or maybe confirmed in a way that feels like a punch to the gut, you really need to grab a copy of this. It's available right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
And honestly, having gone through it extensively for this deep dive, I would highly suggest you do get a copy to follow along. Because Riker structures this thing almost like a mathematical or logical proof. He calls them syllogisms of sovereignty.
Right, syllogisms.
Yeah, and it really helps to see that the arguments laid out on the page, because he is essentially building a massive legal and historical case against the modern world.
Exactly. So please, if you value the work we're doing here, helping you navigate these really deep, unfiltered, and often highly controversial topics so you don't have to drown in them, do us a huge favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and ring the notification bell.
It really helps us keep the lights on.
It does. It helps the deep dive keep surfacing these kinds of forbidden conversations that the algorithms usually try to just bury and hide from you.
And speaking of forbidden conversations, let's talk about the actual mission of this specific deep dive. Because what we are looking at today is what Riker calls a logocentric analysis of history.
Logocentric. Let's stop right there for a second. We hear terms like this thrown around in philosophy a lot, but for the guy listening right now on his commute, what are we actually talking about here? Does he just mean logic-centered?
Precisely. It is centered on the logos.
The Greek concept.
Right, the Greek concept of reason, order, and the word. It represents the structural principle of the universe. We're talking objective truth, cause and effect, the literal laws of physics.
Things you can't argue with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Riker's core argument is that for the vast majority of human history, human civilization was fundamentally logocentric. It had to be. It was built on competence and a harsh reality.
Because if it wasn't, you died.
Right. But he argues we have drifted completely away from that foundation into a society that is drowning in, well, he calls it the gynocentric spell.
The gynocentric spell, that sounds almost, mystical, like we're trapped in a fantasy novel or a matrix of lies.
He actually describes it as a metaphysical fog.
A fog.
Yeah, it's a condition where the entire society, its laws, its entertainment, its baseline morality is entirely oriented around the comfort, the feelings, and the demands of women.
And often at the direct expense of men.
Precisely. And the spell part of that phrase implies that men don't even realize they are caught in it. They just assume that prioritizing female comfort is the natural moral order of the universe.
Wow.
So the mission today is to unpack his diagnosis of this, what he calls the biological imperative of extraction. And more importantly, look at the very specific strategies he proposes for men's rights activists and guys in the manosphere to achieve total economic and mental sovereignty.
Right. And I know a lot of our listeners are men who feel like the core social contract has just been completely broken.
Utterly shattered.
You know, the old deal. You work hard, you provide for your family, you protect them, and you get respect and a stable family unit in return. Riker's basically saying that contract isn't just broken, it's been shredded, set on fire, and the ashes have been weaponized against you.
That's his thesis. He argues that we have to look at the history of our institutions, the law, education, marriage. But specifically, we need to understand them before and after they were captured.
Captured by who?
By feminists and Marxists, in his words. He views it as a timeline of sheer dispossession. He wants to show you the original blueprints of the house, basically, before the squatters took it over and changed all the locks.
Okay, let's really unpack this then. Let's start with the core diagnosis, which is section 1 of his book, The Gynocentric Spell.
Right.
Riker uses this incredibly vivid and honestly pretty depressing image of a Cinderella man. And I have to say, this part was rough to read because it feels like a story you hear at every single bar, every single weekend from some guy.
It's a deeply tragic archetype.
Yeah.
The Cinderella man is the guy who builds the empire.
He does all the heavy lifting.
He fights through the mud, he builds the business from scratch, he secures the mortgage, he constructs a citadel of prosperity, to use Riker's exact words. He spends his 20s and his 30s sacrificing his physical body, his sleep, his mental health to build this massive safety net for his family.
And then what happens?
And then, the exact moment his utility peaks. The moment the business has a liquidity event, or the house is fully paid off, he is liquidated.
Liquidated via a divorce decree.
Exactly. Riker points out a brutal, undeniable correlation here. In a gynocentric system, he says a man is treated literally like a booster rocket on a space shuttle.
Oh, that's a wild analogy.
But think about it. You need the massive, dangerous burn. It's that huge explosion of violent energy to get the payload into orbit.
Right, it does all the work to break gravity.
But once you're safely in orbit, the booster's just dead weight. It's discarded, it falls back into the freezing ocean, and is forgotten.
That is a chilling thought. You're completely vital and useful until the exact second you're not, and then you're garbage. And Riker ties this directly back to biology, right?
He does.
Because he's not saying women are doing this because they are evil in some cartoonish comic book villain sense. He's very, very specific about this mechanism.
That is a crucial, crucial distinction in the manifesto. If you read this and think he's just saying women are inherently malicious, you are missing the entire philosophical point.
Right.
He calls it the biological imperative of extraction, and he references the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer extensively here.
Schopenhauer, the patron saint of pessimistic realism, as Riker calls him. Now, for the guys who maybe skipped Philosophy 101 in college, Schopenhauer wasn't exactly known for being a party animal, was he?
No, Schopenhauer was the pessimist's pessimist. He viewed the entire world as being driven by this blind, irrational, consuming force that he called the will to life.
Okay.
And Riker argues, pulling from this,
Right.
that women are the primary biological avatars of this will to life. Schopenhauer actually viewed women as, and I am quoting the source material directly here,
Yep.
childish, silly, and short-sighted.
Wow.
Riker applies this specifically to the modern context of resource consumption. He argues that women are instinctually driven to extract resources, not out of hatred for men, but out of a cold evolutionary calculus.
So in the caveman days, or the Pleistocene epoch as he specifically mentions in the text, this extraction actually made perfect sense for the species.
It was pure survival. The female needs massive resources for herself and for the highly vulnerable offspring. She had to be solipsistic,
Meaning what exactly in this context?
meaning entirely focused on her own survival needs and the immediate needs of her children, placing those above the abstract needs of the broader tribe or the man.
That makes evolutionary sense.
It does. But Riker's point is that patriarchy, and he uses that word as a highly positive structural organizing term, patriarchy, used to provide the guardrails for this instinct.
It kept it in check.
It checked the consumption. It channeled that raw will to life into building the family and the tribe. It basically said, no, you cannot just take absolutely everything. There's a larger structure here that must be maintained for everyone's long-term survival.
And now,
In the modern era,
without those guardrails of virtue, as he calls them, it's just a feeding frenzy. He actually says, and this is a direct quote, "She will henpeck a happy man because happiness in a man signals he is not serving her needs."
man, happiness in a man signals he is not serving her needs. That hits incredibly hard.
It really does.
It frames male leisure or just a guy trying to relax on a Sunday as a malfunction in the utility machine from her perspective.
Exactly. And when you finally collapse from sheer exhaustion, she weeps crocodile tears, collects the life insurance, and finds the next viable host. Riker is absolutely adamant on this point. Do not mistake this biological process for cruelty.
Because it's just nature.
Right. A shark eating a seal isn't being cruel, it's just hungry. If you jump in the water and expect the shark to be a vegan, you're the idiot.
Right.
Riker says modern men are being idiots for expecting women to act against their own biological imperative of extraction when society has removed all the structural checks and balances. Which naturally leads us to probably the most provocative, incendiary term used in the entire book. He calls this modern dynamic Menkampf.
Yes. It is a highly deliberate and obviously shocking parallel to draw.
I mean, he is literally comparing the modern demonization of men to Mein Kampf, to Nazi propaganda.
He is. And regardless of how offensive people might find that, we need to look at strictly why he draws that parallel. What is the mechanical argument he's making?
Let's break it down.
His argument is that modern academia, the legacy media, and the entire massive diversity, inclusion, and equity industry treat men exactly the way state propaganda in the 20th century treated specific, scapegoated ethnic groups.
It's about the underlying mechanics of how propaganda works on a population.
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
about framing. Riker says they paint men, who are objectively the productive class of society, as the oppressor class.
Right, because if you can convince everyone that the guys building everything are actually the bad guys,
Then you have a moral blank check. If you can convince society that a certain demographic group is uniquely responsible for all the evil in the world, all the toxic masculinity, all the historical wars, even climate change, then you have manufactured the moral justification you need to legally seize their assets.
so the whole thing is basically a giant heist.
It is a massive historical heist disguised as social justice. He calls it an inverted hierarchy. The competent people who literally build the roads, maintain the power grids, and keep the sewage flowing are demonized and taxed by the incompetent people who simply occupy the climate control buildings.
Which brings us perfectly into section 2 of the deep dive, the capture of institutions. Because, as Riker points out, this isn't just happening in people's living rooms or in bad marriages. It is happening systemically in the boardroom and the classroom.
It's institutional.
Riker argues that these core institutions were captured by fundamentally shifting the definition of value itself.
Right. He contrasts two very different opposing types of value here. On one side, you have the logos theory of value.
That's the men actually building stuff in the physical world.
Right. He calls it the infrastructure of reality. He points out, using data, that 99% of the dirty, highly dangerous, essential jobs in society, we're talking high voltage power line repair, deep sea welding, sewage plant maintenance, paving the actual roads, those are done entirely by men.
Because men are expendable in that framework.
Yes, and this is value defined by objective physical difficulty and the solving of real-world thermodynamic problems. If the power grid goes down in a freezing winter storm, you don't call a corporate HR representative to fix it. You call a lineman who has to risk his life climbing an icy pole.
And on the other side of this value equation,
You have what he calls the infantilization of the academy, the massive bloated HR and compliance sector. Riker argues these sectors create absolutely zero tangible value for human survival or progress.
so what do?
They exist purely to police the speech, the thoughts, and the behavior of the men who are actually creating the value. He views them as parasitic social structures permanently attached to a highly productive male host.
He has this one example in the book that is, well, it's hilarious, but it's also genuinely terrifying regarding the state of higher education. He talks about the cry closets.
The University of Utah, roughly around 2018.
I have to be honest, I literally had to pause reading and fact check this myself because I was absolutely certain it was satire.
It reads like a joke.
Right. I thought it was from The Onion. Tell the listeners what this actually is.
It is entirely real. The university officially installed a cry closet right in the middle of the main campus library for students who were feeling too stressed out by their final exams.
A literal closet.
A literal, physically padded, dark room
Yeah.
with a heavy door for adults to go inside and weep because they had to take a test.
You cannot make this stuff up.
You really can't. And Riker uses this incredibly potent symbol to represent the institutionalization of female fragility. He says we have fundamentally moved away from the academy as a gymnasium for the mind, a place designed to toughen you up, expose you to dangerous ideas, and prepare you for a harsh reality.
And we've turned it into what?
A taxpayer-funded nursery for the highly neurotic.
It's the total death of human resilience. And he points out that this is driven by a very specific academic philosophy. He mentions standpoint epistemology.
That is the formal academic term for it, yes. In plain, everyday English, it's basically the idea that a person's lived experience inherently trumps any empirical data or objective fact.
Right, it's the whole my truth versus the facts debate.
Exactly. Riker calls standpoint epistemology a philosophical Ponzi scheme.
How so?
Well, think about how it operates. If a woman feels unsafe in a perfectly secure environment, that subjective internal feeling is instantly treated by the institution as an objective, actionable fact. A fact that requires massive policy changes, new compliance departments, and mandatory training for men, even if the hard crime data says she is statistically safer than she has ever been in human history.
Wow.
It is a closed, impenetrable loop where female feelings dictate physical reality. It completely erodes the logos.
And that loops right into the concept of linguistic warfare. I really love this section because I'm a bit of a word nerd, but Riker takes this to a whole new strategic level. He talks about the push to use the word herstory.
Herstory, it's a classic textbook example of what Riker calls linguistic calumny. He completely breaks down the actual etymology to show how absurd it is.
Right, because history doesn't mean his story.
Not at all. The word history comes directly from the ancient Greek word historia, which simply means inquiry or knowledge acquired by investigation, and has absolutely nothing to do with the English male pronoun his.
But activists try to change it to herstory anyway.
Because it is a raw narrative grab. Riker argues that by pushing to rename history, feminists are openly admitting they aren't actually interested in objective facts or etymology or truth. They're only interested in centering female feelings and asserting dominance over language itself.
It's about power.
It's an overt attempt to linguistically erase the logo, the male ordering principle, from the permanent record of human civilization.
He also talks about weaponized empathy in this section. That's a phrase that really stuck with me long after I put the book down.
It's a highly effective tactic. It's the idea that your own biological compassion is actively being used as a weapon against you.
Because men want to protect.
Right. When you see someone crying or in distress,
Yeah.
your absolute baseline instinct as a man is to step in, to protect, to fix the problem. Riker says this natural empathy has been socially inverted into a suicide pact.
The suicide pact.
You are socially expected and often legally required to sacrifice your own mental health, your finances, and your well-being to continuously soothe the endless emotional turbulence of a demographic group that, frankly, the system tells to hate you.
And nowhere is that clearer than when you look at the modern legal system, specifically family law.
Yeah.
He calls this historical shift the coverture flip.
Yes.
Now, this is a fascinating historical inversion. Can you explain how this works? Because I'm betting most guys listening right now have no idea what the doctrine of coverture even was.
Historically, under the old English common law doctrine of coverture, a husband legally held ultimate authority over the family unit. He decided where the family lived, how the money was invested, the structure of the household.
He was the boss?
He was. But, and this is the massive part that modern feminists conveniently always leave out of the history books, he also bore 100% of the legal and financial liability for that family.
Explain that liability part.
If his wife committed a civil crime, he often had to answer for it in court. If she secretly ran up massive debts with local merchants, he was the one who went to a literal rat-infested debtor's prison.
Wow.
He's the captain of the ship, yes, but he also went down with the ship. Authority and liability were inextricably linked by the logos.
Okay, so you steer the ship, you take the blame if it crashes. That makes logical sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Today, Riker argues, the gynocentric state has completely stripped the man of all household authority. He has zero legal say in whether his own child is born or aborted. He has zero say in whether his wife decides to unilaterally divorce him for no reason.
Thanks to no-fault divorce.
Exactly. He has no baseline presumption of shared custody in most jurisdictions. He has zero authority over the structure of his own life.
But what about the liability?
He retains 100% of the liability. He still has to pay. He still has to financially subsidize the exact household that just forcibly ejected him. Riker directly compares this modern legal setup to taxation without representation.
Which is the literal definition of tyranny.
It is tyranny.
Yeah.
And it's not an accident. It is heavily institutionalized in federal law, specifically things like Title IV-D.
Right, Title IV-D, that's a section of the U.S. Social Security Act, right?
Correct. And Riker ruthlessly exposes the perverse financial incentives built into this. The state government actually gets direct federal kickbacks for every single dollar of child support it manages to collect from men.
Wait, let's slow down on that because that is huge. So the government actually makes a profit by breaking up intact families.
The government makes massive amounts of money by ensuring the absolute maximum transfer of physical assets from men to women via the state collection apparatus. Think about the incentive structure. If a family court judge successfully mediates and saves a marriage, the state gets absolutely nothing. $0.
But if they destroy it,
If a judge orders a divorce and mandates massive, crippling monthly child support payments, the state gets a matching check from the federal government. Riker calls it a bureaucratic bounty hunter system.
that is just sickening.
It frames the family court judge not as a neutral, wise arbiter of justice, but as a highly incentivized collection agent holding a gavel. And the lawyers are just the local enforcers.
And then, as if that wasn't dystopian enough, you add paternity fraud on top of that system.
Cuckoldry codified as state policy, Riker calls it.
Jesus.
In many, many legal jurisdictions right now, even if a man gets a modern DNA test that objectively proves with absolute scientific certainty that the child is not biologically his,
He still has to pay.
if he has been paying for a certain amount of time, or if he ignorantly signed the birth certificate in the hospital, the court will violently force him to continue paying child support under the subjective doctrine of the best interests of the child.
So the state forces you under threat of imprisonment to financially support another man's genetic legacy, simply because your wife lied to you.
While simultaneously being stripped of your own legacy and resources, Riker frames this as the ultimate form of biological theft enforced by the state monopoly on violence.
This is incredibly heavy stuff. But to really arm ourselves, we have to understand the deep psychology behind why it operates this way. Section 3 of the manifesto tackles the psychology of intersexual dynamics.
And Riker definitely doesn't pull any punches in this section either.
No, he doesn't. He talks about the double bind of female desire.
This is what the manosphere classically calls the alpha fucks, beta bucks concept, but Riker formalizes it into a strict logical sequence.
He calls it the syllogism of the shit test.
Right. The core premise here is that women, due to evolutionary pressures, have two completely conflicting simultaneous biological needs. Need number one is genetic survival.
Okay, so getting strong genes for the baby.
Exactly. For that, she instinctively craves hyperdominance. The alpha male, the violent risk taker, the guy who might get killed in a tribal raid, but if he survives, he rules the tribe.
The classic bad boy, the criminal, the user.
Right. Her biology wants his DNA.
Yeah.
The need number two is resource survival. She needs to ensure the child actually lives to adulthood. For that, she requires hyperprovisioning, unending safety, total reliability.
The beta.
The beta, the patient farmer, not the aggressive hunter, the guy who will work a boring desk job for 40 years to pay the mortgage.
And the fundamental problem with this dual requirement is what?
These two sets of traits are statistically highly anti-correlated in the male population. The highly aggressive guy who is crazy enough to fight a literal tiger is very rarely the same guy who is patient and docile enough to farm a field of wheat or change dirty diapers at 3 a.m.
So she literally cannot be satisfied with just one man.
Exactly. Riker argues that baseline female biology is fundamentally programmed for perpetual dissatisfaction. She aggressively needs the visceral thrill and genetic dominance of the alpha, combined with the endless boring wallet of the beta.
And since she can't have both in one guy,
It plays out across a lifetime in what Riker terms temporal warfare.
the timing mismatch between the sexes, let's dig into that.
Women biologically peak in physical attractiveness and sheer mating leverage between the ages of roughly 18 and 23. That is their absolute prime. That's when they have the power to chase and temporarily secure the alpha.
Right.
Men, on the other hand, peak in their true value, meaning resources, societal status, emotional control, and confidence at age 40 plus.
So the nice guy in his 20s just gets completely screwed over.
Riker states flatly that the nice guy is a predator trap. He is very clear on this advice to his readers. Do not ever be the nice guy.
Why is it a trap?
Because men falsely believe that being nice, meaning being compliant, endlessly listening to her complain about her problems, being emotionally vulnerable, they think that is the pathway to a woman's genuine desire.
Because that's what women say they want.
But Riker argues that based on actions, women are actually biologically repulsed by male tenderness because it subconsciously signals an inability to protect her from other violent men.
So what are they attracted to?
They are violently attracted to the dangerous will, which perfectly explains the phenomenon of hybristophilia.
Hybristophilia. That's the clinical term for the sexual attraction to violent criminals, right? Like why you constantly see normal middle-class women sending passionate love letters to serial killers who are locked up on death row.
It is the ultimate undeniable proof that the socially conditioned nice guy narrative is a complete and utter lie. Women fundamentally crave the monster.
They want the danger.
But here's the catch. The nice guy has completely gelded himself. He's destroyed his own edge in exchange for polite social approval, and as a result, he gets neither the approval nor the sexual desire. Riker says women don't want a harmless man. They want a highly dangerous monster that is tamed only for them.
So what's the actual strategy here? If being a nice, polite guy is a biological trap, what does Riker say men should actually do?
He draws a very sharp philosophical distinction between being good and being nice.
Okay, break that down.
Being good is about being highly competent, just totally stoic, and operating on a strict internal moral code. Being nice is just about being socially compliant, weak, and constantly apologetic for your own existence.
So you can be a good man who is also highly dangerous to his enemies.
Precisely. A good man is a lethal weapon with a safety catch. A nice man is just completely harmless, and women despise harmless men.
And what happens when the inevitable emotional storm hits the relationship? When the tears start flowing and that weaponized empathy we talked about kicks into high gear?
He prescribes the gray rock method. This is absolutely essential survival tactics. Riker describes female tears and sudden hysteria as highly evolved tactical weapons.
Weapons designed to do what?
Designed to completely short-circuit male logic. When you, as a man, see a woman crying, your prefrontal cortex, the logical processing center of your brain, literally begins to shut down. It's a biological hack.
You just want to surrender whatever she wants just to make the loud noise stop.
Exactly. So you have to consciously, ruthlessly override that biological programming.
By becoming a gray rock.
You become a gray rock. You provide absolutely zero emotional supply. If she screams, if she cries, if she breaks plates, you sit there and watch her with what Riker beautifully calls the sardonic amusement of a philosopher.
The sardonic amusement of a philosopher.
You do not engage in the argument. You do not try to logically defend your position against an emotional attack. You simply exist in the space, completely unmovable. You train yourself to view her emotional outburst simply as weather.
You don't try to argue with a thunderstorm. Right. You just sit inside, stay dry, and wait for it to pass. It strips her of all emotional leverage.
That's a powerful frame control. Okay, so we've diagnosed the fundamental problem, we've looked at the capture of the institutions, and we've decoded the psychology. Now let's talk about the money.
The real core of sovereignty.
Section 4 is titled The Economic Fortress, and Riker has a whole subsection here on what he calls the fiscal parasitism of the welfare state.
And this is where he brings the hard economic receipts. He heavily cites actual IRS tax data and OECD reports regarding a metric called lifetime net tax contribution.
And what exactly does that data show? Because I feel like people try to hide this.
It shows unequivocally that men are the only demographic group that are net positive contributors to state tax revenue over the course of a lifetime.
Wait, really explain that for the audience. What does net positive contributor actually mean in reality? It means that if you mathematically take all the various taxes a single man pays over his entire working life, income tax, property tax, sales tax, and you subtract the financial cost of all the government services he consumes.
Like roads, schools, whatever.
Right. The final number for men is highly positive. He pays hundreds of thousands of dollars more into the system than he ever takes out. He is the battery powering the state.
And for women?
For women, as an aggregate demographic group, the lifetime net number is negative.
Negative.
Deeply negative. They financially consume vastly more in state welfare, subsidized health care, public schooling for kids, and massive bureaucratic state services than they ever mathematically contribute in taxes.
So effectively, male labor is funding the entirety of the system.
Correct. And the incredibly dark twist that Riker points out is that this captured male labor directly funds the very state apparatus that actively demonizes men.
Right.
You were literally paying the six-figure salary of the HR bureaucrat who writes the diversity regulations that destroy your own small business.
You're funding your own destruction.
You are heavily funding the Section 8 housing and welfare checks that allow single motherhood to be a completely viable state-sponsored career choice. Riker explicitly calls this fiscal parasitism.
It's an inescapable feedback loop of doom. You work harder to pay the taxes fund the state attacks you and takes your kids.
And he reiterates, this is taxation without representation. It is a massive, forced wealth transfer mechanism from the male productive class directly to the female voting bloc.
And how does modern marriage fit into this economic trap? He has a chapter called The Heresy of Romanticism.
He views modern marriage not as a loving spiritual partnership, but strictly in financial terms as a leveraged put option on a man's life.
A leveraged put option. Okay, for the non-finance guys, break that down.
In high finance, Buying a put option gives you the legal right to sell a specific asset at a predetermined, highly favorable price, regardless of what the market is doing.
Okay.
Riker argues that signing a state marriage contract basically hands a woman a free put option to cash out the man at any point she chooses.
She can exercise the option whenever she's bored.
She can legally break the contract without any penalty whatsoever, thanks to no-fault divorce laws, and she gets to walk away with half of all the assets he built, plus a massive guaranteed chunk of his future unearned income via alimony.
And the man has absolutely no legal mechanism to stop her from exercising that option.
None. The state enforces it with police power. In fact, Riker takes a very radical legal stance here and argues that all modern marriage contracts are effectively void ab initio,
Void from the beginning. Why?
because men are forced to sign them under extreme duress.
Duress. Like someone is holding a gun to their head at the altar.
Social and biological duress. The constant threat of total ostracization. Society relentlessly bullies and shames men into marriage, labeling them as immature or commitment-phobic Peter Pans or creeps if they refuse to sign the state contract.
Right.
Riker points out a basic tenet of contract law. If you are psychologically coerced or shamed into signing a horribly one-sided legal contract, that contract is fundamentally invalid.
So, given all this institutional and economic warfare, what is his actual actionable advice?
Ghost the Matrix.
Ghost the Matrix. That sounds exactly like John Galt in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
It is the exact same underlying philosophy. Go Galt. Withdraw your labor. Stop feeding the monstrous beast that hates you.
Just opt out.
If the entire corrupt system mathematically relies on male ambition, male stress, and male tax dollars to survive, then the single most revolutionary, destructive thing a man can do is simply stop providing those things.
Quiet quitting on a civilizational scale.
Kill your ambition, or at the very least, completely hide the financial fruits of it from the state. Downsize your life.
He also spends a lot of time aggressively attacking what he calls the simp economy.
Oh, he hates the digital brothels.
Yeah.
OnlyFans, Twitch e-girl donations, Instagram models.
He is absolutely scathing here.
He views the simp economy as a pathetic, voluntary Ponzi scheme. It is a massive mechanism for transferring hard-earned generational male wealth straight from profoundly lonely, isolated men directly to women who absolutely despise them.
He calls it paying for your own execution.
Exactly. You are financing the vanity and the hypergamy of the exact women who view you as entirely subhuman.
So instead of throwing $20 a month at some OnlyFans creator, where does Riker say men should actually be putting their resources?
Into crypto and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations.
Why crypto specifically? Just for the gain?
No, not for the gains, for the sovereignty. Because crypto is inherently judgment-proof, or at least vastly harder for a corrupt state to seize.
Explain the mechanics of that.
If your life savings are sitting in a standard Chase bank account, a disgruntled family court judge can completely freeze it and drain it with one single signature on a Tuesday morning.
Right. It's gone before you even wake up.
But if your wealth is securely held on the blockchain, in a cold storage hardware wallet where only you possess the private cryptographic keys, that family court judge can bang his wooden gavel until his hand bleeds.
It doesn't matter.
It absolutely does not matter. The fundamental laws of mathematics and blockchain physics simply do not care about gynocentric court orders. They cannot take what they cannot cryptographically access.
It's really about building an unreachable economic fortress around yourself.
Exactly. He also highly suggests using heavy debt strategically as a shield.
Debt as a shield. Usually guys are told to avoid debt.
Right. But he says you should mathematically mortgage your physical real estate properties to the absolute hilt. Pull all the equity out.
Why?
Because if you have zero visible equity on paper, because it's all leveraged and hidden in offshore trusts or crypto, there is absolutely nothing lucrative for the ex-wife's divorce lawyer to actually take.
You make yourself a terrible target.
You make yourself completely judgment-proof. You turn yourself into a jagged, worthless rock that simply isn't worth the legal effort to squeeze.
That is highly tactical. It's literal economic guerrilla warfare against the family courts.
It is. And it perfectly leads us into the ultimate grand solution of the book.
Yeah.
Section 5, Building the Manosphere Jerusalem.
I love that title so much. The Manosphere Jerusalem. It sounds incredibly biblical and prophetic.
It is very biblical in its scope. Riker isn't just talking about individual guys surviving in the shadows anymore. He is literally laying out the blueprints for building a parallel patriarchal civilization.
And he says that entirely starts with a return to the logos.
Right back to the classical basics. The trivium.
Which is what for the audience?
The foundational structure of classical education, logic, grammar, and rhetoric. These were the intellectual tools that built Western civilization, and they have been deliberately removed from modern public schools.
Because they make people too hard to control.
Right. Riker says men desperately need to reclaim these specific mental tools to logically dismantle feminist arguments in real time.
Because feminist arguments fundamentally rely on emotional manipulation.
Exclusively.
Right.
And you cannot successfully fight a hysterical emotional argument with more emotion. You will lose every time.
Because they are better at it.
Right. But if you have cold, hard logic, you can easily cut right through that metaphysical fog. You can instantly spot the logical fallacies, the shaming tactics, and refuse to engage on their terms.
He also extensively talks about achieving the Overmensch. This is a heavy Nietzschean concept.
Yes, the Übermensch. Riker argues we have to evolve past the last man.
Describe the last man.
The last man is the perfectly sedated, heavily medicated, endlessly Netflix-watching, soy-consuming, porn-addicted modern male who just accepts his own slavery.
The guy sitting in the pod eating the bugs.
Exactly. Riker says the Overman completely rejects the pod. He weaponizes his own natural testosterone for massive creation and dominance. He categorically refuses to ever apologize for his aggressive masculine nature. Instead, he channels it to build empires.
But where do we actually build these empires? Because Riker realistically points out that sometimes the single best strategic move a man can make is to just pack up and leave.
Geographic arbitrage. He calls it the expatriation ace card.
The whole idea of going where you're treated best, getting your passport.
Passport bros are already doing this on a small scale. But Riker takes it further. He explicitly points to fast-growing patriarchal nations. Places like Vietnam, Thailand, parts of Eastern Europe like Georgia.
Right.
Places where the toxic woke infrastructure simply hasn't taken root yet.
Where a man is still fundamentally respected as a man and a provider is honored.
Yes, and where the drastically lower cost of living allows you to actually keep the massive surplus value of your own labor instead of giving 60% of it to a gynocentric tax system.
But he goes even further than just moving to Thailand. He gets into some wild libertarian territory. He talks about seasteading.
Yes, the concept of building actual physical micronations out in the deep ocean.
Literally floating cities in international waters.
The underlying logic is beautiful in its purity. Out in international waters, the cold laws of physics, engineering, and free market commerce absolutely must rule, or everyone drowns.
There is no room for DEI on a deep-sea oil rig.
Exactly. He argues that in an environment that hostile female feelings and HR compliance mandates instantly take a backseat to male competence and the logos. If you build a floating, decentralized city, you place yourself entirely outside the tyrannical jurisdiction of the Western family court system.
It is the ultimate expression of physical sovereignty.
But the absolute most sci-fi and honestly most mind-blowing and controversial part of this entire manifesto is what he calls the final red pill, the technological solution.
Right. Ectogenesis.
The development of fully functional artificial wombs.
Riker specifically calls this the syllogism of liberation.
He does.
Now, walk us deeply through this specific argument. Why is this singular piece of technology so massively important to his overarching thesis? Because frankly, this sounds completely dystopian and terrifying to a lot of average people.
You have to follow the cold logic of power. His core argument is that the female biological monopoly on the means of human reproduction is the absolute root source of all their unearned societal power.
Okay, keep going.
It allows women to effectively charge an extortionate womb tax on the entire male population. Men historically submit to all this resource extraction, the marriage laws, the dangerous jobs, simply because they desperately need women's biological cooperation to continue their own genetic line.
Right. Men want children, so they pay the toll.
But what happens to that power dynamic if you introduce fully scalable artificial wombs into the market?
The monopoly is instantly broken.
Good.
Forever.
Completely shattered. The female biological container becomes technologically obsolete. Riker argues this one single scientific advancement effectively nullifies all the leverage women currently hold over men.
Because men won't need them anymore to have a family.
If men, or a coalition of men, can securely reproduce and raise the next generation entirely without the extortionate social contract of modern marriage, or the absolute terrifying risk of the divorce court meat grinder, the civilizational leverage shifts 100% back to the men who own the technology and the capital.
It frees up all that trapped male energy, all that money that goes to alimony and bad marriages.
It permanently frees men from domestic servitude. Instead of spending 50 years of their lives desperately placating a hostile partner just to secure access to reproduction, men can fully focus all that surplus capital and aggressive energy on building what he calls a true spacefaring civilization.
It sounds totally wild, like something out of a cyberpunk novel, but when you actually look at the current rapid pace of biotech and AI,
It's really not as far off as people think.
yeah.
We are already seeing the early stages of it in animal trials, and Riker absolutely sees this technology as the ultimate necessary step to permanently building a true logocentric civilization.
A society based purely on male competence, rigid hierarchy, and objective truth.
And here is the real kicker that makes people furious. He claims this patriarchal return is actually good for everyone.
Even the women.
The benevolent sexism argument, yes. He claims that reestablishing strict patriarchy, or at least a heavily masculine logic-based order, actually saves human society from the destructive chaos of completely unchecked female emotion. He argues, based on happiness data from the 1950s versus today, that women are actually significantly happier, less medicated, and less anxious when there's a strong, unyielding patriarchal structure built around them, even if they currently claim they want total liberation and girl boss freedom.
It's the old saying, right? The ship absolutely cannot have two captains or it sinks.
Exactly. Someone has to be the final authority, and he argues it must be the one who bears the liability and understands the logos.
So, after all of this, what does this massive manifesto mean for the guy listening to this right now? We've covered a staggering amount of ground today.
We really have.
We looked at the initial diagnosis, the brutal capture of the institutions, the dark psychology of intersexual dynamics, the economic fortress strategies, and the wild technological future. What is the takeaway?
It means, very simply, that as a man, you have a choice to make today. You can choose to just stay plugged into the matrix.
Keep your head down.
Keep apologizing for your masculinity. Keep paying massive taxes into a system that openly hates you and wants to replace you. Or you can take what Riker calls the pragma.
The pragma, the ultimate call to action.
Audit your life right now, today. Look around and find exactly where your value is being quietly stolen.
Look at your relationships.
Are you currently in a toxic relationship that is basically just a one-way street of resource extraction? Are you grinding away at a corporate job that directly funds your own demographic demonization through HR initiatives?
Are you the Cinderella man we talked about?
Are you exhaustingly building a massive castle that someone else is just going to take from you in family court in 5 years?
Stop apologizing.
Absolutely stop apologizing, never apologize for being a man, and start aggressively building the lifeboat.
Right.
Whether that means quietly getting your vulnerable physical assets secured into cold storage crypto, or heavily planning your eventual expatriation move to a jurisdiction that actually respects you, or just mentally completely detaching from the desperate need for female validation.
Reclaim your sovereignty.
Reclaim your total sovereignty, because no one else is going to give it back to you.
Man, powerful stuff. And honestly, you guys can start reclaiming that right now by connecting directly with the source material. You need to follow Conrad Riker. He is publishing over on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
Highly recommend the Substack.
That is where he does these brutal, daily, deep dive breakdowns of the ongoing culture war. The guy is relentless.
And you definitely want to follow his Twitter, which is at Conrad Riker. And check out his YouTube channel at Conrad and Riker.
Oh yeah, the video essays.
He does these incredible long-form video essays that are just absolute surgical dismantlings of mainstream legacy media narratives. They are genuinely brilliant and satisfying to watch if you're red-pilled.
And of course, the book itself. The foundational manual we just spent all this time dissecting. Women work, men extract resources, drive to death, betray, divorce, and inherit.
I know, it's a massive mouthful of a title, but it is a literal survival manual for the modern era.
Get it right now on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
And crucially, once you read it, leave a 5-star review. As Riker explicitly says in his community, we have to actively fight these algorithms.
Because the system actively tries to bury this exact kind of information.
It does. Leaving a highly rated review is a small, easy act of digital rebellion that pushes the book higher in the rankings and gets in front of more men who desperately need to wake up.
Well said. We want to leave you guys with this one final, really provocative thought straight from the very end of the book. It's the image of what Riker calls the singularity.
A coming, undeniable golden age. But it is very specifically not a golden age for everyone.
It's an exclusive future.
It is a glorious future, exclusively built by the men who adamantly refuse to bow to the gynocentric spell. A hyper-advanced intergalactic world constructed purely on silicon, hardened steel, and unbreakable cold logic.
The only question left is, will you be one of the architects building it, or will you just be one of the extracted men left behind in the mud?
That is the ultimate question you have to answer for yourself.
Exactly. Guys, if this deep dive really resonated with you, if it gave you that punch in the gut you needed, share this right now with a friend who desperately needs the red pill. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to help us keep this dangerous signal strong against the algorithmic suppression.
Stay sovereign, guys. Don't let them break you.
Keep building the fortress. We'll see you in the next one.